The bell above the door rang at 4 o'clock the way it did every Sunday, and Clara Hofer's hands went still in the flour. She had learned over the months not to look up too fast. There was a whole grammar to the man who came at 4 on Sundays, and the first rule of it was that you did not appear to be waiting for him. So she finished folding the cream, wiped her fingers on her apron, and only then lifted her eyes. And there he was, filling the doorway of her tiny candlelit shop, the way a shadow fills a well. Snow melting on the shoulders of a black coat that cost more than her month's rent. His face, the kind of still that other kinds of stillness are measured against. The whole quarter was afraid of him. She knew this the way she knew the weather. In the narrow streets around the Spittelberg, where the lamps were still gas, and the buildings leaned their old foreheads together over the cobbles, people lowered their voices when the black car idled at the corner. They called him Herr Varga when they had to speak to him, and nothing at all when they didn't. Konstantin Varga. Clara had heard the stories, the way you hear thunder in another valley. Men who owed him, men who crossed him, men who simply stopped being mentioned. She did not know which stories were true. She had decided in the careful way she decided things that it was not her business to find out. Because Konstantin Varga paid, and Clara Hofer needed to be paid. Fräulein Hofer, he said. His voice was low and even, and it did something to the air in the room. The usual. As if it were coffee, as if it were nothing. She turned to the back shelf where the box already waited. She made it fresh every Sunday morning now before she opened, because she had learned he did not like to wait, and she carried it to the counter and set it down between them. A mourning cake. Her mother's recipe, the old one, the one almost no one alive still made. Dark and dense and bittersweet walnuts and sour cherry and a breath of clove. The kind of cake her mother had said was baked not for birthdays, but for the ones who didn't have any more of them. A wake cake, a cake for the dead. And across the top, in Clara's steadiest hand piped in pale royal icing, a single name. This Sunday the name was Anton K. "Would you like me to write anything more?" she asked the way she always asked, and he said the way he always said, "No, just the name." He laid the money on the counter, always cash, always too much, always waving away the change with 2 fingers, and he lifted the box with a care that did not match the rest of him, as though it held something breakable or holy. For one moment his eyes came up and met hers, and Clara felt the floor of her stomach drop the way it did every Sunday, some current running under the fear that she refused to look at directly. Then he was gone, the bell ringing behind him, the snow swallowing the black shape of him, the box under his arm, uneaten, always, never once eaten in her shop. She never asked who it was for. That was the second rule. She told herself she never wondered. That was a lie, and she found out how much of a lie the next morning, when she opened the Sunday paper to line the pastry trays, and her eye snagged on the death notices, and there, 3 lines down, black-bordered in stiller trower, was a name she had piped in icing not 18 hours before. Anton K., suddenly at 51. Clara stood very still in the cold gray light of her empty shop, the paper trembling very slightly in her hands. And for the first time she let herself do the arithmetic she had been refusing to do for months. The name changed every Sunday, and every Sunday in that same week's paper the name was dead. She told herself there were explanations. She was good at telling herself things. It was how a person survived alone in a city that did not especially want her. Perhaps he was in the funeral trade. Perhaps these were friends, associates, an old man's long roll of losses. Perhaps Vienna simply buried a great many people, and coincidence had a longer reach than she wanted to believe. But she started keeping the papers. She didn't decide to. It happened the way dangerous things happen, one small permission at a time. The next Sunday, the name was Rudolph S., and on Monday, she opened the paper before she opened the shop, and there he was, Rudolph S., after a short illness. And she folded that paper and put it under the counter instead of throwing it away. The Sunday after that, Joseph M. Then the widow Brenner, the only woman, and that one kept Clara awake, though she couldn't have said why. By the 4th week, she had a small stack of newspapers under her counter, like a secret, and a small stack of terrors to match, and a man who came at 4 o'clock and looked at her 1 second too long, and carried her mother's cake out into the snow to lay it, she now understood, on a grave. She should have been afraid of him. She was afraid of him. But there was another thing tangled in with the fear that she could not name and did not like, and it had to do with his hands. Because the man was a monster, she had all but proven it, stacked the proof under her own counter. And yet when he lifted the box, he lifted it the way you lift a sleeping child. There was a tenderness in it, so total and so private that watching it felt like trespassing. Whatever the cake was, whatever the names were, it was not cruelty. Clara had grown up around grief. She knew the shape of it from the inside. And the way Constantine Varga carried her cake out of her shop every Sunday was not the way a man handles a trophy. It was the way a man handles the only thing he has left of someone. She knew that particular carefulness. She had it too. She had a whole recipe book of it. The book sat on the shelf above her work table, where she could reach it without looking, the way you keep a hand near your own heartbeat. It had been her mother's Marta Hofer's, a fat, swollen, flour-dusted thing, bound in cracked oxblood leather, its pages gone soft as cloth from 30 years of handling. Every recipe written out in Marta's slanting hand, and then annotated, re-annotated, crossed through and corrected in the margins, until some pages were more marginalia than recipe. The morning cake was on page 41. Clara knew it by heart, and baked from the book anyway, every day, because turning to page 41 was the closest thing to hearing her mother's voice that she had left. Her mother had died when Clara was 9. Illness, her aunt had always said in the flat, final tone that closed the subject. A long illness, a wasting one, nothing anyone could have done. Clara had been sent from Vienna to the aunt in Graz within a week of the funeral, so fast she had never even seen the grave. And she had grown up in that quiet gray house with 2 things of her mother's, the recipe book, and a single photograph of a laughing woman, with Clara's own dark eyes, standing in the doorway of a Vienna patisserie that no longer existed. When the aunt died, Clara had done the only thing that had ever made sense to her. She had come back. She had found this little dying shop 3 streets from where her mother's photograph was taken, and she had reopened it, and she had baked her mother back to life, 1 page at a time. She had never once imagined that her mother's recipe would walk in the door wearing a killer's face and ask for it by name. It was the 6th Sunday, the name that week was Karl V, when Constantine Varga broke the grammar for the first time. He set down his money and he lifted the box, and then, instead of turning to go, he stood there a moment longer than the rite allowed, looking not at her, but at the shelf above her work table, at the fat oxblood book with its cracked spine. And something moved across his still face like weather across a mountain, there and gone. "That book," he said quietly. "Where did you get it?" Clara's pulse jumped. It was my mother's. For a long moment he said nothing. The candle between them guttered. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, gone lower, gone careful the way a man's voice goes careful around a wound. "Your mother," he said. "What was her name?" And Clara, who followed the rules, who never asked and never told, who had built her whole safe small life on the principle that the less you offered the world, the less it could take from you. Clara looked into the face of the most dangerous man in the quarter and did the thing she had never once done for a customer. "Marta," she said. "Marta Hofer." She watched it land. She would spend a long time afterward trying to describe what happened to his face when she said the name, and the closest she ever came was this. It was the face of a man who has spent 20 years walking away from a house and turns a corner and finds himself standing in front of it again. He did not gasp. He did not stagger. A muscle moved in his jaw, and his knuckles whitened on the box, and his eyes came to hers and held them. And for the length of one held breath, the fear she felt for him and the pull she felt toward him became terrifyingly the same thing. "Lock your door tonight," he said, "and do not tell anyone that name again." Then he was gone into the snow, and Clara stood shaking behind her counter, with the terrible new knowledge that her mother's name meant something to a man who left cakes on graves. The storm came the following week, and the storm brought the men, and the men taught Clara exactly what Constantine Varga was. It was past closing, the snow coming down in earnest, now muffling the whole quarter into a white hush. When the bell rang, without the door properly opening, a wrongness she felt before she understood it. 2 men came in fast out of the storm, and they were not customers. She knew it, the way a rabbit knows the hawk's shadow in the body before the mind. One of them said her mother's name, Hofer. He said it like an accusation. And then Constantine Varga came through the door behind them, out of the snow, and the small warm shop, full of the smell of clove and butter, became in the space of a heartbeat something else entirely. She never afterward remembered it in order. She remembered it the way you remember a fall in bright broken pieces, out of sequence too fast and too slow at once. She remembered Constantine's voice low and almost gentle saying don't, and one of the men not listening. She remembered the sound, enormous, obscene, filling the little room and the front window coming apart into a curtain of falling glass. She remembered flour, that was the strange thing, the thing she carried longest. The shelf of flour sacks bursting, the whole shop filling with a slow white cloud. Powdered sugar and flour, drifting down through the muzzle light like snow. Like the snow outside had gotten in, so that the violence happened inside a soft white blur that made no sense against the noise. And she remembered Constantine Varga's body over hers. He had crossed the room without her seeing him move, and put himself between her and the door. One arm sweeping her down and back behind the counter, his whole frame a wall. And when it was over, when the shop was silent and white and ruined, and the two men were down among the broken glass and the drifting flour, he was still there, breathing hard, one hand flat against the wall above her head, close enough that she could see the blood already blooming dark through the white of his shirt, along his ribs where a shot had grazed him, close enough that she could see he had not so much as flinched. He looked down at her, flour in his dark hair like early gray, blood on his white shirt. His eyes, which the whole quarter feared were fixed on her face, with an intensity that had nothing to do with the dead men on her floor. "Are you hurt?" he said. Not a question so much as a demand of the universe. "No," she whispered. "You're bleeding." "It doesn't matter." And then so quietly she almost lost it under the ringing in her ears. "They came for the book, not for you. Do you understand? Not yet, for you." He straightened, wincing, and looked around the wreck of her mother's shop, the shattered window, the white ruin, the cake box knocked to the floor with Carl V smeared across the broken lid. And something in his face closed like a door. "It isn't safe here anymore. It hasn't been safe since the day you put that name back over your door. And I let it happen, because I couldn't make myself stay away." He said it flatly, a confession offered like a wound. "That was a mistake. I'm going to spend the rest of my life paying for." "What are you?" Clara breathed. He picked the cake box up off the floor and held it, ruined as it was, with that same unbearable care. "The last person who ate your mother's cooking," he said, "and lived." The kind old man came 3 days later, while the window was still boarded over. He came in the middle of the afternoon like an ordinary customer, a small, elegant gentleman of perhaps 75, silver-haired, a camel coat, a walking stick with a horn handle, and a smile of such gentle warmth that Clara felt it disarm her before she could remember to be careful. He admired the little shop. He commiserated over the boarded window. Such a shame, such violence in the quarter these days. He bought a slice of the Linzer torte and ate it at the small table by the window, with the slow pleasure of an old man who had learned to take his time. And he told her, with tears standing in his kind eyes, that her pastry reminded him of a woman he had known long ago, a wonderful baker, the best in Vienna, gone now, gone so young. "I don't suppose," he said, dabbing his mouth with a handkerchief, "that you make the old mourning cake, the dark one with the sour cherry. No one makes it anymore. She made it. Marta." He smiled at the memory so fondly, so sadly. Marta Hofer. Did you ever hear the name? You have something of her look about you, my dear, if you'll forgive an old man for saying so. Clara's blood had gone to ice. She kept her face still. She had learned stillness from a master, she realized, from watching Constantine, and she said lightly that she had bought the shop from an estate and knew nothing of the woman who had it before. The old man nodded satisfied, or pretending to be, and he finished his tort and left a generous tip and wished her well and went out into the gray afternoon with his horn-handled stick. And it was only when Constantine appeared in her doorway an hour later, white-faced beneath his calm, that she understood how close she had come to something. "Emmerich Vogel," Constantine said. "The old man who was here, describe him. The stick, the coat, was it him?" When she nodded, he closed his eyes for a moment, and it was the only time she ever saw fear on him, and it was not fear for himself. "Everything he told you was true," he said. "That's what makes him what he is. He knew your mother, he praised her baking, he wept over her, and he is the man who had her killed." The word went through Clara like the shot through her window. Killed. Her mother had died of an illness, a long illness, nothing anyone could have done. She had built a whole self around that flat gray sentence, and Konstantin Varga had just taken it in 2 hands and broken it over his knee. "You're lying," she said, and heard how badly she wanted it to be a lie. "I have never lied to you," he said. "It's the only clean thing I have left, and I'm not going to ruin it now." He came into the shop and stood in the ruin of it, and looked at her with those feared eyes gone soft and terrible. "Sit down, Clara. It's time you knew whose daughter you are, and whose ghost has been buying your cakes." He told her everything, and the telling took the light out of the sky. 22 years ago, he said he had been a boy, 14, 15, half-starved, sleeping in doorways, running messages for the men who owned the Spittelberg, because it was that or die in the cold. He was nothing. He was less than nothing. And one gray morning, a woman had come out of a patisserie 3 streets from here, and instead of chasing off the filthy boy loitering by her bins, she had brought him a cup of coffee and a slice of dark cake. And she had done it again the next day, and the next, until it became a thing. Until the back step of Marta Hofer's shop became the only warm place in Konstantin Varga's world. She fed him for 2 years. She taught him to read from her recipe cards. She taught him, God help them both, to bake. And the one recipe she made him learn by heart, drilling him on it, laughing at his clumsy hands, was the old morning cake. Page 41, walnuts and sour cherry and clove. "A cake for the ones who don't get any more birthdays," she used to say. "Somebody should mark them going. Somebody should say a name." "She was the only person in my life who ever treated me as though I were a person," Konstantin said. His voice did not break. It was worse than breaking. "And I got her killed. Because Marta Hofer had a second life, one the boy never knew. She kept books, not recipe books, the other kind. For years the syndicate had used her shop as a clean, quiet place to move money. And Marta trusted, precisely because she was nobody, had kept the true accounts. And Marta, who was braver than anyone knew, had grown sick of the blood she was quietly tallying, and had begun in the only code she trusted, no one else could read, to write it all down. Every payment, every name, every murder. Emmerich Vogel had ordered on his climb to the top, in the margins of the one book she carried everywhere, and no one would ever think to open. Her recipes, names hidden as ingredients, account numbers folded into oven temperatures and rising times. A confession disguised as a mother's cooking kept in plain sight, waiting for the one person she trusted to one day understand it. Vogel found out she was keeping a record, Konstantin said. He didn't know where. He couldn't find the book. So he had her killed to end it, and I was the one sent to bring her in that night, because I was the one who could get close, because I was the boy she loved and trusted. His hands were very still on the table. I didn't know what they meant to do. I swear to you I didn't know until we were already at her door. And I was 15, and I was a coward, and by the time I understood it was too late to do anything but watch. He looked up at Clara, and there it was, 20 years of it naked in his face. The last thing your mother did was lie to protect you. She told them she had no daughter. She'd already sent you to Graz under your aunt's name. She hid you the way she hid the book somewhere they'd never think to look. And then she let them believe there was nothing left to find. His voice dropped to nothing. The first name I ever piped in icing was hers. I was 16. I've done it every week for 20 years for every soul I've sent into the ground since, because she told me somebody should mark them going. Somebody should say a name. It's the only prayer I know, and I learned it from your mother. Clara was crying without sound, the way she did everything, contained alone, even now. And the shop, she managed. You didn't find me, you came looking. I found you, he said. 3 years ago, I found out Marta Hofer had a daughter who'd survived, and I found out that daughter had reopened her mother's shop under her mother's name, 3 streets from where it all happened, baking her mother's cake for anyone who walked in, a terrible, tender ghost of a smile. I told myself I'd come once, just to see her face, just to buy one cake from Marta's daughter and lay it on Marta's grave, and never come back. He shook his head slowly. I came every Sunday for a year, because you have her hands, Clara. You have her hands and her eyes, and you carry that book near your heart, exactly the way she did. And you have no idea that you've been serving the man who watched her die. Her own confession, baked fresh, every single week. She did not speak to him for 4 days. She could not. There was too much of it, and all of it at once. The mother resurrected only to be murdered a second time in the telling. The illness that had never been an illness, the aunt's flat gray lie that Clara now understood, had been mercy or terror or both. And under it, worse than any of it, the thing she could not forgive herself for. That even now, knowing what she knew, when she thought of Constantine Varga standing in the snow, with her mother's cake held like something holy, what she felt was not only horror. She had let a man into her shop who had stood at her mother's door on the last night of her mother's life, and she could not make herself stop wanting him to come back. On the 5th day, she opened the book. She had been afraid to, and then more afraid not to. She sat at her work table in the closed shop, with the boarded window, and she turned to page 41, the mourning cake, and for the first time in her life, she read it not as a recipe, but as a message, and once she saw it, she could not unsee it. The marginalia, the tiny, slanting corrections that made no baking sense, reduced to 4, hold, at 11, the 3rd of the month, numbers that were not measurements, names folded into lists of ingredients, like walnuts among the walnuts, a second language running in the white spaces of every page, patient, coded 20 years unread. Her mother's true book, hidden inside her mother's recipe book, hidden in plain sight on a shelf in a shop full of the smell of clove, waiting all this time for the one person Marta trusted to grow up and come home and finally understand. "This is real," the margins said, in their 1,000 small ways. "I made it. Someone I love will read it." Clara was still sitting there when the bell rang, and Constantine was in the doorway with the snow behind him, and she looked up from her mother's confession with her whole face wet, and she did not tell him to leave. "She left it for me," Clara said. "All this time. She left it where only I would ever hold it." "I know," he said. "It's enough, isn't it? To finish him. To finish Vogel. It's enough to hang him 10 times over." Constantine crossed the shop slowly. "It's also enough to get you killed the moment he learns it exists. Which is why you're going to give it to me, and you're going to disappear, and you're going to let me be the one who—" "No." Clara stood. She was shaking, and her voice was low, and it did not waver. "You've spent 20 years saying her name over graves because you couldn't save her. You don't get to make me a grave you say her name over too. This is my mother's book, and my mother's shop, and my mother's fight. You want to finish it." She lifted the oxblood book off the table and held it against her heart the way Marta used to. "You finish it with me, not for me, with me." He looked at her for a long moment, this feared and terrible man, and then he did something she had never seen him do. He reached out slowly, the way he reached for the cake box, and he laid his hand against the side of her face, and he stopped fighting the one thing he had been fighting since the first Sunday. He did not kiss her. He only stood there with his hand against her cheek, and his forehead coming down to rest against hers. Two people who had each spent their whole lives carrying the same dead woman, finally setting the weight down together. "With you," he said. "God help me. With you." Emmerich Vogel came for the book on the last Sunday of the year in the snow, the way everything in Clara's life seemed fated to happen in the snow. Constantine had known he would. That was the whole shape of the plan, because the ledger, however damning, was only paper until Vogel himself could be tied to it in the open, in front of the men whose loyalty he owned. And there was only one thing on earth that would draw the old man out of his fortress and into the Spittelberg in person: Marta's book. He had spent 20 years and a fortune hunting it. He would come for it himself the way a man comes for the one loose thread that could unravel everything he had ever built. And Constantine had made sure, through the careful leaking of a careful rumor, that the old man believed Marta's daughter had finally decoded her mother's confession and meant to take it to the magistrates in the morning. So Emmerich Vogel came, and he did not come kindly this time. They came in 3 cars into the narrow white street, and the little shop that smelled of clove filled with armed men and cold air, and at the center of them, the old man himself, camel coat, horn-handled stick, no more grandfather in his pale eyes. He wanted the book in his hands. He wanted to watch it burn, and he wanted Marta Hofer's daughter to watch it burn first, and then to follow her mother, because Emmerich Vogel had learned, across a long and bloody life, that the only truly buried secret is the one with no one left alive to remember it. What he did not know, what Constantine had spent 3 years and every favor he was owed arranging, was that the men filling that little shop were not all Vogels anymore. That the rumor drawing the old man out had also drawn out the last question the syndicate had never dared ask aloud: whether the empire they served had been built on the murder of the one harmless woman who had ever fed the boys among them coffee on a cold morning. That some of those men, too, remembered Marta Hofer's back step, and that Constantine Varga had spent 20 years becoming exactly powerful enough exactly patient enough to make them choose in the one moment it mattered. It still ended in blood. These things always end in blood. Clara would remember it, as she remembered all the worst nights of her life in bright, broken pieces. The old man's voice silk over stone, ordering the book brought to him. Constantine stepping into the space between Vogel and Clara, without seeming to move, the way he had stepped between her and the door once before. The moment the room split, half the guns turning impossibly the wrong way, toward the old man instead of away, and Vogel's face finally at the very end understanding. The window coming apart again into falling glass, the flour and the powdered sugar bursting into the air, so that the whole terrible thing happened once more, inside a soft, slow blur of white, a blizzard indoors, the snow getting in. And Constantine, when it was over, standing in the middle of the ruined shop, with blood soaking dark through the white of his shirt, and flour drifting down through the muzzle light around him like snow, one arm curled around Marta's oxblood book, held against his chest, and the other flung back to keep Clara behind him, exactly as he had stood the first time, exactly as he would have stood 1,000 times. A man built entirely in the end to put himself between her and the door. Emmerich Vogel lay among the broken glass, with the snow coming in the shattered window to settle on the camel coat, and it did not melt. And Constantine turned gray-faced, swaying, and looked at Clara through the drifting white, with those feared and gentle eyes. And the first thing he said, the only thing, was, "Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, going to him, her hands already going to the ruin of him, the way her mother's hands had once gone to a starving boy. "No, you're bleeding." "It doesn't matter," he said, and put the book into her hands. Somebody should say her name. He lived. He had a genius for surviving the things that should have killed him. She supposed 20 years of grief had made him unreasonably hard to end. And in the weeks that followed, the thing Marta Hofer had died to leave behind finally did the work she had trusted it to do. The coded ledger, deciphered at last 20 years and one daughter too late for Marta, but not in the end too late, went everywhere at once into the hands of magistrates who had waited a generation for exactly this. And the empire Emmerich Vogel had built on one woman's murder came apart in a season. Constantine dismantled the rest of it himself, quietly, methodically, the way you take down a house you can't bear to keep living in. What he built in its place, Clara never fully asked about. She had decided, in her careful way, that some things could be left unlit. She rebuilt the shop. The insurance was slow, and the window was expensive, and Constantine, who could have paid for 100 shops, understood without being told that she needed to do it with her own hands and her own slow money, and only helped in the ways she let him, which grew week by week to be a great many ways. And on a Sunday in spring, with the new glass clean, and the whole shop bright with the smell of clove and butter, the bell rang at 4 o'clock, and Clara looked up from the flour without being careful about it at all. And there he was in the doorway. No snow on his shoulders now, no blood, just the man. "The usual," Constantine said, and the corner of his mouth did something it had never once done in her shop before. She brought the box to the counter. Inside was the mourning cake, page 41, walnuts and sour cherry and clove, and across the top, in her steadiest hand, a single name. But this Sunday, the name was not in the death notices. This Sunday, the name was Marta, and there was a second box beside it, and inside the second box was the same cake, uncut, and 2 forks. "Sit," Clara said. "You've carried her out of this shop every Sunday for a year. This week, you're going to stay and eat." And Constantine Varga, the man the whole quarter feared, the boy Marta Hofer once fed on a cold morning. The mourner who had laid 1,000 cakes on 1,000 graves, because he could not save the one that mattered, sat down at the little table by the window, in the light, across from the daughter with her mother's hands, and let her set a fork in front of him. And for the first time in 20 years, he did not carry the cake out into the cold to lay it on the dead. He ate it there in the warm with the living, Marta's name between them on the table, Marta's recipe on their tongues, Marta's daughter watching him across the candle, with dark eyes that were her mother's eyes, no longer waiting to be left, no longer alone in a shop full of ghosts, because the ghost had finally been laid to rest, the only way ghosts ever are, which is by being loved out loud, by name, by someone who stayed. Outside, the snow was gone. Inside, the bell was still. And somewhere under the counter, the old newspapers had long since been thrown away, because there were no more names to keep. There was only this one, the first and the last, spoken now, not over a grave, but over a table in a warm, bright room, by two people who had stopped being able to be left. Marta. Somebody said her name.